Hey review family, keep it tight, it's Anthony Fantano here, back again to bring you another video. Welcome back to the Metal Tempest. It's hard to believe that I've been doing this fucking YouTube thing for 6 years now, and in this niche growing up, some of the creators that brought me up have been some of the most beloved hours of my life that I've spent engaging with the community, watching their reviews, and really just having a lot of admiration and respect for them as content creators and what they have provided for this niche and for this community. Obviously, growing up, I had much more of an affinity for metal content creators, but I think that the harbinger that sort of everyone at one point or another have watched something from, you can't fucking escape him on the internet, Anthony Fantano. I have been turned on to so many amazing musical projects that I would not have been exposed to otherwise without his contributions to this community, and him being the internet's busiest music nerd is a moniker that I think is more than well deserved. And even though I don't agree with a lot of his takes on a lot of different things, I think that no matter what you have to say about him, you can't deny the fact that he is an extremely hard worker and he has paved the way for so many other content creators to come after him. With that being said, throughout the years, he has gotten a lot of critique for moving away from a lot more rock and metal and experimental music like he covered in his early days to more pop and hip-hop centric electronic, more popular sort of reviews. And you can attribute this to a variety of things, but I'm not here to pitter-patter about that. I am just going to talk about the fact that he has literally had some of his worst takes in the eyes of his fans be about metal. I don't think that there is a single community of music listeners that are as pissed off at Anthony Fantano as consistently as metalheads. I have watched Anthony Fantano pretty religiously for the better part of a decade at this point, and throughout that time I have become very well acclimated with a variety of his reviews, but the ones that I always look forward to the most and consume no matter what they are his metal reviews. Whenever he talks about metal, whenever he does wrap-ups, I am keen to hear what he has to say on a certain subject. Therefore, I thought it would be a fun idea to go over 15 albums, technically 16 metal albums, that I think that Anthony Fantano was wrong about in his opinions. This goes for both positive reviews and negative reviews, and I'm obviously just going to give my personal opinions on them, but for the sake of not letting my opinion dictate what you think about his reviews or what he has to say, I'm going to be linking the reviews of all of these records that he did in the description box below if you want to go check them out yourself. At the end of the day, this is coming from my own personal opinion. It's not the gospel, it's just my opinion about these records in rebuttal to what he thinks about them. With that being said, what are some Anthony Fantano opinions, metal rock or otherwise, that you don't agree with? Let me know down in the comment section below, but without further ado, let's get into it. So first off, the first record I'm going to be talking about is A Diabolical Thirst by the band Spectral Wound, which he ended up giving a 6 out of 10 to. His opinion of this record really shocked me because it seemed like he was willing to praise it very much so, and this seems to be a common trend where he'll praise a record a lot but just give it a very low score, or in general a lower score than what you might anticipate. He described this record as sort of a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, but he ended up giving it a 6. And his opinions pretty much boiled down to just feeling like some of the ideas were more basic and not fleshed out. But quite the contrary, I believe that this is one of the freshest black metal records in the year it released. It ended up being one of my favorite black metal records that dropped that year. I thought that the production was ferocious, I thought the vocals were throat-shredding, and the level of proficiency in the instrumentation and just the hellfire that was being conjured up on this album, I think was deserving of a higher ranking, because there are plenty of bands that do exactly what Spectral Wound do, correct, but those bands don't do it to the level of efficiency that I believe they were able to do in their sound. But the bands that contemporarily play in the same wheelhouse as Spectral Wound, I don't think have the same level of execution or efficiency that they do. Similarly, in the black metal department, I really didn't agree with what he had to say about Portrayal of Guilt's record, We Are Always Alone. If you're unfamiliar with Portrayal of Guilt, this is another record that he ended up giving a 6 out of 10. They are a blackened screamo band, and that is a genre that I was very happy to see covered because Portrayal of Guilt in the modern sphere have become one of the more household names in that niche. And once again, he just felt like some of the ideas were not fleshed out enough, not diverse enough, and he felt like it was kind of half-baked. And my personal opinion of that, his complaints felt like it was more about the extremity not backing up the substance. But when it comes to these two genres being mixed together, I don't think you could ask for a better combination of an eclectic style. Because let's be honest, black metal and screamo, they have been meshed for a while now. It's nothing new, and there are plenty of bands that do it, but it's hard to find a band that is a gut punch quite like Portrayal of Guilt did on this record. I found the storytelling and the poeticism about this record to be fantastic, and I understand that it may not be his own cup of tea when it comes to the extremity not really backing up the substance of the record or feeling like it was like a wallpaper sort of situation, but I just think that when it comes to this genre, you couldn't have asked for much better. Moving on to a very, very popular review, and if I remember correctly, I think this ranked in like his top 15 or top 10 maybe, that being Cemetery's mixtape Rainbow Bridge 3. I ended up checking out this record because I was so captivated and enamored with how he was describing it. And I'm generally speaking someone who really likes experimental music and avant-garde music, and I also really like modern trap metal, so I was really excited to hear how he was describing this being like a combination of trap metal and horrorcore and meme music and a little bit of witch house. I was like, this sounds pretty damn cool. But as someone who spends a lot of hours scouring Bandcamp, I have heard so many artists and so many fucking bands that just sound exactly like this. Just a bunch of bips and bobs and whirligigs tossed into a cauldron and turned up with such heavy distortion and such heavy noise, and the amount of feedback on everything and the unintelligible vocals at times and just the over-the-top meme aesthetic. I think it's a fun record, and I think the aesthetic is really like fresh in terms of you don't really hear much done with this exact style, but there are plenty of bands on Bandcamp and a plenty of just specifically solo artists that perform in like the horrorcore and trap metal and witch house genres that combine these influences. And I think the only reason that Cemetery stuck out so heavily is he took those influences and put it into one, but individually, if you strip this record back, I don't think it's necessarily doing anything that you couldn't get from a multitude of other solo artists that really just turn up the heat and distortion and noise and call it a day. Just because you bass boost something to hell doesn't automatically make it a good album, and this ended up getting a high 8. I believe it got a mid to high 8, and I just cannot see that. I would have probably given it like a 6 or 6.5 at the absolute most. I just could not get behind this record and didn't understand the hype behind it. Oh god, I remember when this next one came out, I was just sitting there like, damn, this is rough. Paysage d'Hiver, Imvold, he gave it a 3 out of 10 if I remember correctly, and boy oh boy, this got a lot of people pissed because I ended up loving this record and having a very fond appreciation for this record that I didn't have when it first released. If I remember correctly, when I reviewed it, I think I gave it a 7, if I remember correctly. I may have given it lower than that, but when you go back and listen to this record, there are few projects, even in like the solo atmospheric black metal veneer, that had this level of chilling lo-fi atmosphere. Like, there are hundreds upon thousands of low fidelity, low recordings, like low quality black metal bands that just sound like brittle bones clacking together in the fucking caves of Norway. That's nothing new, but something about this record just felt so magical and so ethereal and translucent and difficult to maintain, and it really was an experience for how long it was. And I know that he didn't particularly like the incorporations of like field recordings, and he felt like it was just cobbled together atmospheric black metal with some synths and field recordings, but I genuinely think when it came to lo-fi black metal, there's a reason that this record generated so much hype, and it's because I really think that it touched a lot of people in a way that the multitude of other bands that kind of perform in a similar style were failing to do, because you could get this from a lot of other bands. The reason this was rising at the top of the corpse pile and getting so much attention and acclaim was obviously because of the background of the record and the project itself, but the sound was so atmospherically beautiful, and it was so rich and textured and simplistic and minimalistic. It just was amazing, and I really didn't agree with his ranking of this album. So technically the next is 2 records, both being from Cattle Decapitation. The first being Monolith of Inhumanity, and the second being Death Atlas. So Monolith of Inhumanity, he did not give a formal review to this thing. It was in a Why You Know review way back, and yes, I literally remember this shit, because I've watched Anthony for years, and the reason that I think this is such a weird review is he called the sound of Monolith of Inhumanity too mechanical and too manufactured and too perfect and engineered, and that would be perfectly fine if that was his opinion. But the issue is not more than a couple years later, when the Anthropocene Extinction came out, he ended up, if I remember right, giving that album an 8 out of 10, and it ended up being one of his favorites that year, when in reality, I think the Anthropocene Extinction is even more mechanical, even more melodic than Monolith of Inhumanity. And speaking of melodicism, in his review of Monolith of Inhumanity in the Why You Know review, he talked about how he just wasn't a big fan, if I remember correctly, of the, like, sung vocals that Travis Ryan did, the more throaty, like, melodic vocals. Why would you say that when literally not more than a couple years later, the Anthropocene Extinction had literally more singing than ever? And then he ping-pongs back with his Death Atlas review, where he ends up giving that record like a 6 out of 10, if I remember right. And he said he didn't like the singing portions on the record. And it's really weird, his opinions of Cattle Decapitation, because he likes them in splurges, and it's weird because the Anthropocene Extinction, while it is a fantastic Cattle Decap record and probably my favorite, I do agree that it's a fantastic record. By like gore grind and death grind standards, if you like the Anthropocene Extinction, you probably would like Monolith of Inhumanity, because at their core, they are very similar in the way that they are executed, in the way they are performed, and I'm not entirely sure why the opinions would conflict with that. Now, as for his criticisms of Death Atlas, I really think Death Atlas should have gotten a higher score, solely because the apocalyptic nature of it and the cataclysmic nature of it and how everything comes together to make it really feel like the end of the world, they play into the thematics of that perfectly, and I think that he was going into this record thinking it was going to be similar to the Anthropocene Extinction, when in reality they were leaning more into the melodicism, they were leaning more into the macabre nature of it, because they were trying to embody the end of the world, leading up to their releases, where like slowly but surely you can see the conceptual nature of their albums building up to that point. And I'm curious to see, like, if he ends up reviewing their new album, what his opinion is going to be of it. I'm just very weird when it comes to his different opinions of Cattle Decapitation, because they seem a little bit weird and inconsistent, and it's hard to tell where he actually stands on them as a band, because he is so all over the place with his opinions of them. Next up, Full of Hell, Weeping Choir. This got such a low score, and I will never understand why. He has a habit of really liking Full of Hell because he really liked their collaboration with Merzbow. But he was not a big fan of Trumpeting Ecstasy. He wasn't a big fan of Weeping Choir. And once again, this is another case of him praising the hell out of a record, but then giving it a lower score. Now, I understand why he didn't like this record. He felt like it was a flurry, that it was a blur, and he wasn't a big fan of some of the noisier sections. But I just really feel like this was Full of Hell's most expansive release in terms of experimentation, in terms of pushing the envelope, and I think simultaneously that was the biggest strength of this record, but also the biggest reason that it seems like Anthony didn't like it, because all of his criticisms of the noisier bits, of it being too quick, or of it being just experimental but not executed properly, I think is the very reason that this record is so strong. Next up, his opinion of Eternal Blue by Spiritbox. What the fuck is his opinion of Spiritbox? Courtney LaPlante is a fantastic vocalist. She has great vocal chops, amazing metal growls, really smooth vocals, and I think that Spiritbox's combination of metalcore and post-hardcore music, post-rock music, ambient music, alternative metal, I think that it is one of the fresher things we have heard in the last 5 or 10 years. He kind of wrote it off as just a combination of simplistic influences, which I don't really hear a lot of other bands in the contemporary scene doing what Spiritbox are doing. And it's weird because I feel like some of the bands that he does praise in these niches are more simplistic than Spirit Box. And while Spirit Box are not the most technically proficient or like experimental band on the map, I certainly think that they are worthy of more praise for the combination of eclectic styles that they do embody. And oh lord, I think this is my least favorite take he has ever had in terms of metal, and maybe it's just because it's a band I personally really love and hold close to my heart, and a lot of other people were mad about this. What was his opinion of Architect's record Holy Hell? I could not find the Why You Know review on this, so I'm not going to be able to link it. But I might try to look for it post-production, but he literally called this whimpery, whiny metalcore music, and he said that it was his least favorite type of metalcore mixed with his like least favorite type of post-hardcore or whatever. Architects are literally one of the best metalcore bands, and you can not like the vocal style, maybe that's something that you're just not a big fan of, but atmospherically, production-wise, lyrically, conceptually, everything about Architects have set them a cut above the rest for a reason. Now, I do agree with his modern takes on Architects. I think Architects nowadays fucking suck. I am much more of a fan of like All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us and Holy Hell, like that era of Architects, but wow, he has just had some harsh takes of Architects, and I guess you could just put, like, gent just collectively here, because when it comes to, like, you know, all of these bands, like the Born of Osiris's, the Veil of Maya's, the Architects, the Peripheries, all these bands, like, he has just never had a solid opinion of gent, and I just think it comes down to it not being his cup of tea. I don't think he has reviewed a single record positively from a gent band, not even like a band like Meshuggah, which aren't just specifically gent. I don't think he has ever reviewed a gent record positively. Jumping back to a positive review, Undeath with Legions of a Different Kind. I'm going to be honest with you. I have a ton of respect for Undeath as a band. I think that they're cool dudes. Everything that I've seen from them, like interview-wise, they seem like fantastic, lovely people. But when it comes to Anthony Fantano's boner for this band, to give them 8 out of 10s and 7 out of 10s, I just don't get it. I think Undeath are capable of writing some good riffs. I think that as a old school death metal worshipping band, they are doing perfectly fine. But what the fuck are they not doing that you can't get from any host of 20-buck spin bands? I hear Mortiferum, I hear Coffins, I hear Tomb Mold, I hear Witch Vomit, and I literally think that they are just as good, if not better, than Undeath. Even a popular band that I think is overhyped as hell, Blood Incantation. This style of old school death metal worship, I don't think Undeath are doing anything in the riff department, in the production department, in the vocal department, in the songwriting department that is setting them above these other bands that Anthony has called shitty or dime a dozen or whatever. It just seems very strange that this is the singular band he seems to praise amongst this pile of bands, because he rarely reviews them positively. But I've really heard nothing in Undeath's catalog that has proven themselves to be a cut above these other bands. And that's coming from someone that follows a lot of these OSDM worship bands. I even made a video about like death metal getting stale. Next up, Dance Gavin Dance with Afterburner. If I remember right, he gave this thing a 4 out of 10. Him and Dance Gavin Dance, he has some of the most notorious reviews on his channel, being Dance Gavin Dance reviews because of his poor scoring. He has not been a fan of them. He has not been a fan of their style. I personally think that you can't get what you get from Dance Gavin Dance anywhere else. And I understand he is not a fan of these hyper slick choruses. He doesn't like the weird combination of post-hardcore and metalcore being mixed together. He thinks it's phony. He thinks it's flimsy. He thinks it's cringy. He thinks it's corny. He has never liked to Dance Gavin Dance in that way, and I personally just disagree entirely. I think that in terms of Tillion's vocals, John Mess, I think that the guitar patterns, I think that the rhythmic sections, the combination of post-hardcore and math rock and mathcore and all of these different influences coming into this weird alternative eclectic style, you cannot find another band that sounds like Dance Gavin Dance, and they scratch a certain itch. That's why I personally just disagree with his opinions of them, and while I do understand the accusations of them being cringy or corny, maybe because of their fan base or because of some of their lyrics, the absurdism of some of their lyrics is somewhat of a hallmark for them. And anyone that researches them will know that that absurdism and out there vibe with their lyrics is something that they have clung to for a while. It's not anything new. Next up, Fallujah with The Flesh Prevails. This got a 4 out of 10, and I remember, I don't have much to say about this one other than, once again, another genre, deathcore, he has not been a fan of. He has notoriously reviewed deathcore records just horribly. He thought that this was machismo. He thought it was mechanical. He kind of has this habit of saying things are mechanical whenever they're like in the technical department, but when it comes to like, not to mention him calling Fallujah technical death metal, which I get where you could come from, but this record is much more deathcore than anything else. I think that their combination of technical death metal and deathcore and the breakdowns, the really slick production is part of the reason that this record stands out and why Fallujah did at the time. You gotta understand, when this was released, it was before its time when it came to a lot of these bands. And I don't know if in retrospect he'd have a different opinion of it, but it was so before its time when it came to its production values, because nowadays it's not uncommon to see these bands have really slick, mechanical, hyper-engineered production, but around that time, deathcore in the grand scheme of things was pretty raw. It was still pretty lo-fi. Maybe not lo-fi for some of the really big bands like the Whitechapels and the Suicide Silences, but it was much more raw than what you get nowadays from bands like Acrania and bands like Infant Annihilator and Rings of Saturn for sure. I really didn't agree with his opinions of Tool's record Fear Inoculum. He just felt like this was not a solid comeback, and I just don't agree with that. I think that it was the anticipation building up that disappointed so many people, but I do not think that this record was worthy of the amount of criticism that he ended up giving it. I think this is a perfectly serviceable Tool record. And I understand the Gap may have made people's expectations a bit higher, but kind of like Dance Gavin Dance, you can't get what you get from Tool anywhere else. And in his review, he thought that the riffs were a lot weaker than they used to be on older Tool records. He thought it was a lot more pretentious and a lot more drawn out. And while I can agree that I said in my review that I wasn't a big fan of how drawn out and stretched out a lot of this record felt, and that is a very worthy criticism, I don't think that it just completely throws the entire record away, because within those stretched out songs, there are a lot of atmospheric sections, a lot of beautiful sections, good songwriting. And while it is certainly more minimalistic than other Tool records in terms of how it's put together, and it's maybe not as progressively dense as some of the classics in their catalog, I definitely think it was worthy of a much higher score than it ended up getting. Oh boy, I just saw the next one on the list. Bring Me the Horizon's record Sempiternal. Do I even need to go into this? This is one of his most notorious metal reviews, and I just disagree with almost every point he says. Metalcore was so fucking defined by Bring Me the Horizon in the 2010s. And in retrospect, he said that he likes There's a Hell Believe Me I've Seen It, There's a Heaven, Let's Keep It a Secret, and he even liked That's the Spirit somewhat, and obviously he has grown to like them more and more, but holy hell, he just really doesn't like Sempiternal. He has said that it's not his cup of tea, and I understand some of his criticisms, but the fact that he says the lyrics are on the nose and corny, that is Bring Me the Horizon's whole thing, and that genre is literally notorious for those type of on-the-nose lyrics. He isn't a fan of Ollie singing his raspy vocal delivery, when in reality he is one of the more unique vocalists in metalcore and one of the most hyper-identifiable, that if you hear his voice, he is not going to blend into the crowd if you turn on a song like Shadow Moses or Sleepwalking or Can You Feel My Heart. He seemed to praise a lot of the electronic isms on certain tracks like Can You Feel My Heart, but he completely ignored them on other tracks and even sold them down the river in some ways, when electronics and synths played a massive role on this record because of Jordan Fish. And Jordan Fish's inclusion on this record brought about some of the only things that Anthony actually liked about this record, and he criticized the past Bring Me the Horizon, but seemed to simultaneously praise the introduction of the things that Jordan Fish did, but also ignore them on other tracks. And it seemed like the only tracks he managed to go into in depth were pretty much the ones that were the the most popular on the record, or the standout tracks that were like push, like Can You Feel My Heart and Sleepwalking and Shadow Moses, while completely ignoring songs like Antivist and Hospital for Souls, which are some of their best and most genre and band defining tracks of the 2010s. I just personally disagree with a lot of his assessments of it being corny or on the nose. I think that adds to a lot of its intrigue and a lot of its value, and instrumentally, vocally, lyrically, I think Bring Me the Horizon were on another level at this point for a reason. Okay, the last two records I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to lump these together because they're very similar in the type of genre that they perform in. The first being Vane FM with Error Zone, and the other being Loathe with I Let It In and It Took Everything. If I remember correctly, both of these records ended up getting 6 out of 10s, and honestly, I'm really surprised he was not more down with these two records. He praised the hell out of Error Zone for being eclectic, and he praised Loathe for being eclectic, but there are few bands in the modern crop of like the new metalcore alternative scenes that embodied that hectic, chaotic, frazzled out electronic alternative style like Loathe and Vane FM have done. And he even reviewed another Vane FM record, and I don't think he was a big fan of it either. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember what he ended up giving that record, but it was weird. He really praised Error Zone, but then ended up giving it a fairly low score, and a quite common complaint he has with a lot of bands is that it all blurs together into a blend. I just personally disagree with his takes on Loathe and Vane FM because I think that they are both two of the coolest bands in metalcore, and he has liked other bands that do similar vibes to them like Code Orange, which are I guess just a more heavier and breakdown-centric thing, but when it comes to like heaviness and songwriting and the inclusion of all these synths and alternative influences, I actually really like both of these bands and like the new metalcore movement. What are your opinions on these records? Maybe you disagree or agree with my opinions, and are there any other Anthony Fantano takes that you have just disagreed with? Be sure to let me know down in the comment section below. This is all in good fun and respect. No harm, no foul. I'm not the gospel either. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.